We're rocking. Good afternoon, Sheffield. Thanks to Martin for inviting me to come over here today and speak. It's very gracious of him. Steelmaking started in the UK. The world's first steelmaking in the commercial scale was here in Sheffield, with Henry Bessemer and his famous Bessemer converter. But it's not just steel. This small island started the Industrial Revolution. We were the leaders not just in steel, but in many other industries. Nobody could touch us. This small nation led the way in most things. How times have changed. We no longer lead the world. Our manufacturing industry is slowly disappearing. In fact, the steel industry stands on the brink of extinction. The recent announcements seem to have caused surprise and shock. Why? The warning signs have been building up for the last 8 years, since the global recession in 2008. The global slowdown in steel demand, the oversupply of steel. China alone produces 50% of the world's steel demand. The workforce at Scunthorpe alone have been kicked again and again with cuts in shift pay, wage freezes, cuts in pension benefits, 3,000 job losses over the last 7 or 8 years since the recession, and that's not including the contractors and people in the supply chain, and more cost-saving initiatives than you can ever imagine. There have been similar cuts in the rest of the steel industry. 720 at Rotherham and Stocksbridge, another 1,050 at Port Talbot in South Wales, and the rest of the UK steel industry in Tata UK. But there used to be more than that. 22,000 people work for Tata UK. There used to be more than that worked in Scunthorpe. And about the same figure again in South Wales, and probably even more than that in the Sheffield area. But all these cuts and losses, all they've done is simply buy us a little time. They were never going to fix the problems that we faced, because the problems were cheap imports from China, high energy prices, high business rates, carbon floor taxes, R&D taxes, the lack of an effective procurement policy, and this government's distinct lack of a credible industrial policy. The steel industry could do nothing about these things, but we know a man who could. David Cameron, the leader of the government for working people. So the unions, along with the steel companies, started a huge campaign to get the government to make changes that would give the steel industry a fighting chance to survive, a level playing field to compete in. We lobbied, we had visits from ministers, we went along to debates in Parliament, we demonstrated in Brussels to try and put pressure on the EU. After all, this isn't just significant to the UK, this is a EU problem. And we had marches and rallies. In fact, the march and rally in Scunthorpe attracted around 2,000 people. Now that might sound a lot by London standards, but for Scunthorpe that was epic. We've not seen anything like that in decades. It's something the local community get. Lorry drivers, bus drivers, even police cars were pipping the horns and waving in support as we walked through the town. These are proud steelworkers who are not only fighting for their jobs, but fighting for their livelihoods and the survival of the town and community. Because if the steelworks goes, the town goes with it. And they got it. They understood what would happen if the steelworks closed. So what does happen when you lose a major employer like the steel industry? Unemployment's the immediate effect, but there's also an increase in homelessness. Shops close. Businesses that support that industry close. People in the supply chain lose their jobs, which adds to the unemployment problem even more. People move away, crime rises. Every time you have a business that goes under a large employer, crime goes up. That's a fact. Yet all these things are avoidable if the government just act on the things I've mentioned. We're not asking for them to throw money at us. We're just asking for a level playing field, a chance to compete on a level playing field. The steel industry is a foundation industry, an industry which the rest of the manufacturing industry relies upon. It's an industry that survived many tough times. 2 world wars. It's even survived the attacks from Margaret Thatcher and her henchman Ian McGregor. It's an industry that's been instrumental in putting the great in Great Britain. Yet what the government did when we asked them for help hid behind warm words, empty rhetoric and EU rules. So here we stand today with a steel and street limbo, on the verge of disappearing altogether, simply because the government for working people failed to act for those working people. Now today's rally is all about George Osborne's Northern Powerhouse. Well, I've seen a lot of comedians in my time, George, but I've got to say, you take the cake. Do your homework, George. We had a Northern Powerhouse. This country was a world leader in manufacturing, and the majority of that industry was in the north of the country, with a workforce as proud and dedicated as any in the world. But that's been eaten away by every Tory government since Margaret Thatcher came into power, until it's just a shadow of what it used to be. But it's not just manufacturing that's suffering at the hands of the Tories. What about the NHS? Again, a workforce as proud and dedicated as any in the world. Some would say even more. A health system that was the envy of the world, but which is now in tatters thanks to Jeremy Hunt and his predecessor Andrew Lansley. Our education system, once one of the best in the world, but also into turmoil by Nicky Morgan and her predecessor Michael Gove. The police force, cut to the bone by Theresa May, and she hasn't finished with them yet. Benefit cuts by George Osborne, leaving people in poverty. The numbers of people living on the streets rising. Families and young children struggling to keep a roof over their heads. The fire and ambulance services have also had their share of attacks. These are life-saving services that the public depend upon, for God's sake. We live in the 21st century. We are governed by a party with Victorian values. This is not a government for working people. It's just another Tory government that looks after the rich, just like they've always done. Remember the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? Well, we've now got 6. Sajid Javid, Nicky Morgan, Jeremy Hunt, Theresa May, George Osborne, and the lead apocalyptic horseman, David Cameron. Well, I've got a message for David Cameron and his government. There's an old saying that says you reap what you sow. Well, you've sown the seeds of a storm, Mr. Cameron, and it's coming your way! Hear, hear.